Does your family ever get exasperated with you for stockpiling such things as paper towels, bottled water, or toilet tissue? Well, they certainly can't object to you stockpiling money. Silver, the only money recognized by the U.S. Constitution, and your first 10-ounce bar of pure silver can be had at spot price with no premium by going to sdbullion.com/rp. And when you buy it that way, you'll be supporting Reluctant Preppers as well by going to sdbullion.com/rp. Thanks. This is a quick update to thank you for building our number of patrons to 76 and growing on patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. Soon, when we reach 100 active patrons, we're going to start sending out a 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle each and every month to one active subscriber, so you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We are excited to have this first-time guest tonight with us. When we spoke with former IRS agent Joe Bannister just over a week ago, he remarked that his initiation into having his eyes opened into the fraud and the illegality and unconstitutionality of our federal income tax came when he heard a talk radio show with an interviewee named Devvy Kidd, Devvy Kidd. She's with us here today. Devvy, thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
It's my pleasure, and I've been a prepper since 1994.
Well, you're right at home here with our crop of listeners, and we wanted to congratulate you. You've got a very heavily trafficked website, DEVVY, that's dv.com. You've written for newswithviews.com, worldnetdaily.com, and the usobserver.com, and you've been on over 4,000 radio interviews. We're just delighted that you're able to join us here for this first time on Reluctant Preppers.
I'm happy to be here. It's great.
You sent me out a physical booklet that you've published a large number of, Why a Bankrupt America, and it has some very provocative facts claimed on the front cover. One of them is one that's very familiar to our viewers, and that is that the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. That I think they're very well versed in, and we've also had G. Edward Griffin, from the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, on our show a couple of times. So they're also indoctrinated, I think, a bit in the truths and facts versus the mythology surrounding the Federal Reserve itself. But one of the things that Joe Bannister really woke us up to was his claim that he had checked out over a period of years as both a CPA and an active IRS agent, special agent, and that was that the ordinary U.S. taxpayer is not constitutionally liable to pay federal income tax. That is just a shocker that spawned quite a bit of even controversial replies, and comments on the part of our viewers. But do you have anything to add to what Joe Bannister opened us up to?
I did a radio show, KSFO Hot Talk, out of San Francisco. A friend of mine was a host at the time, and I had no idea that Joe was listening to the show, but I got this phone call one day from, "Hi, my name's Joe Bannister, and I'm a CID agent for the IRS."
It didn't start very well, did it?
And I said, "Okay." I said, "What can I do for you?" And he said, "Well, I listened to you on Jeff Metcalf's show on KSFL Hot Talk about 2 years ago." And he said, "I thought you were full of baloney." He said, "But I went ahead and ordered your book." And he said, I just could not accept it. I was going to prove you wrong. So he set out trying to do just that. And I will always remember the first time I met him. Joe is very tall. I'm only 5'3", but he's like 6'3", and he's like a string bean. But I drove to the San Francisco Bay Area to meet him and his attorney, who's also an attorney representing a lot of Second Amendment organizations out in the San Jose, California area. So we meet at a pizza parlor, and I'm sitting at the table, and he walks up and he puts his badge and his gun on the table. And he said, "Hi, I'm Joe Bannister." I said, "Hi." but we've become real, good friends over the years. But it was very difficult for him. I mean, here's a man who had an $80,000 a year job, and we're talking back in the year 1999 or 2000 now.
Right.
And a promising career and everything else. And Joe is a devout Catholic, and he is a person of extreme and strong integrity. And he told me, while we were eating pizza, that my booklet, Why a Bankrupt America, caused him to have a moral dilemma that he could not ignore.
Yes.
And they made his life hell. Did he talk about when he was charged and was put on trial?
All he talked about was that he brought his findings to his superiors, and they said, not only are we not going to back you or support you or look into this, but we need to have you turn in your resignation. And he realized that he had to either walk away at that time from a stellar career, or face being undermined the remainder of any career that he would have had left. That's as far as we heard.
Yeah, well, a couple of years later, he was charged by the federal government, and it had to do with withholding tax and a few other things. But his trial was in Sacramento, and at the time my late husband and I lived only about 10 minutes from the federal courthouse downtown Sacramento.
Okay.
And the charges were bogus. But we out there, patriots, we raised over $80,000 to pay his legal bills. But it was nerve-wracking to sit in court and watch these IRS agents sit and squirm in their chairs. They had no case.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, the jury came back with a unanimous decision. They acquitted him, hands down, on everything. And afterwards, we were outside and talked to some of the jurors, and they were angry.
Yeah.
Because they said, based on the testimony and everything, they just felt that the government was wasting everybody's time and that they had it in for Mr. Bannister.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so stressful. I don't know how he could stand it, quite frankly. But he's got a lot of courage, and yes, he is correct in that domestic Americans are not required to file federal income tax returns, and people who can do the research, or they can just ignore it. A good friend of Joe and mine, Tommy Cryer, who passed away June 4th of 2012. Tommy was a constitutional attorney for 40 years over in Shreveport. And Tommy was charged with willful failure to file and tax evasion. And he was one of the most intelligent people you've ever met. He finally got the federal dragoons to drop the tax evasion charges, and he went in. When you're charged with willful failure to file or tax evasion, you cannot bring in any evidence to the contrary. The people like Joe Bannister, people like Tommy, were barred in federal courtrooms from testifying on behalf of the defense. There's a defense that you can use called it's where you have a sincere belief that you weren't required to file the return.
Right.
And there was a landmark decision about that. It had to do with an airline pilot. But in Tommy's case, they went after him with a vengeance. And the same thing happened. The jury found him not guilty on all charges, acquitted him of everything. And then the government did, and of course it was a huge blow, both Joe's trial and Tommy's, for the IRS. But Americans need to understand that when it comes to the Internal Revenue Service and taxation of income taxes, U.S. prosecutors and federal judges are joined at the hip. There is no justice in the courtroom. The best you can hope and pray for is that you get individuals on the jury who can see the lies through the sworn testimony. But what they do after an acquittal, like Joe and Tommy, they went after Tommy civilly.
Okay.
I mean, they sue you for. There was an airline pilot oh gosh, I can't remember her name. I'll remember it in a minute. This was a woman who was short, actually about an inch shorter than me, and she was a pilot for FedEx.
Okay.
And she also got charged with willful failure to file. And she was acquitted. But the government did the same thing. They sued her just like they did Tommy for the taxes. Just because you're acquitted by the jury doesn't mean that the monstrous federal government with all the resources at their fingertips won't come after you, because they will. But when I try and have been trying for 29 years, this is what I've been doing, is get people to understand the history. Now, G. Edward Griffin, who I know and have met, and he's just a wonderful, kind gentleman. Get them to understand what happened in 1913. There were three things that happened. It wasn't just Jekyll Island, but Jekyll Island, it was very important for the globalists, the banking cartels, or whatever you want to call them, the whole complex. They wanted to figure out a way to hijack the monetary system of this country. They needed a way to feed it, number one, and they also wanted to destroy the wonderful balance that the founders and creators of the Constitution created when they created Congress. So in 1913, the Secretary of State at the time simply declared that the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had been ratified, and that was the so-called income tax. Well, we know that it was not ratified by enough states.
Okay.
Now, in December 23rd of 1913, 2 days before Christmas,
Right.
the corrupt Congress passes the Federal Reserve Banking Act of 1913, the biggest money heist in the history of the world. And in between that, in mid-1913, the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was declared ratified, even though it was not. And people always ask me, well, what's the 17th Amendment? Well, instead of, as the Constitution says, state legislators shall choose their 2 U.S. senators to go to Washington to represent the interests of the state. It was one of the first things they did at the Continental Convention in 1787. Now, Yale books, I forget what the title is, but Yale puts out 3 books on the Continental Convention.
All right.
It is, so I have all 3 of them. But on the 5th day of the convention, this is what they tackled. How are we going to set up Congress so that it works for everybody? So we're going to have this Congress, we're going to divide it into 2 bodies. The House of Representatives, the people will vote for. The U.S. Senate will be senators chosen by their state legislatures. And if they don't do what the state wants, the legislatures fire the senator and they appoint a new senator.
Okay.
Which, if the 17th Amendment fraud didn't continue, John McCain would have never remained a senator from Arizona. They would have booted him decades ago. Now, I know the 17th Amendment is to be a fact because I sued the state of Texas to keep Ted Cruz off the ballot. And I proved, because I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I got every single document there in existence, not to mention a few others. California and Minnesota did not vote for the 17th Amendment, which made it 2 states short.
Okay.
So the judge that I had simply didn't care. They brought this judge out of retirement. It took forever to get to trial, and I live 6 hours from the Capitol in Austin. So the courthouse was packed with people. Every courtroom had overflowing except ours. And we had a huge courtroom, and there was me and the 2 state attorneys, the judge, and the recorder. And the judge, there was almost 500 documents that I submitted to prove all kinds of things, the ways to prove it. Well, the judge, he looked like Santa Claus because he had put his robe on when he finally got to the bench, and he had suspenders and looked like he drank 18 bottles of beer. But he just said, well, so what? He said, that happened a long time ago. And then he looked at the state and he said, what kind of sanctions do you want to impose on her? And my heart just sank. And the state said, nothing, Your Honor. And the judge blew a diaper right at that point. He was so mad. You're not going to propose you don't want any sanctions against her for bringing this lawsuit? They said no. And I had some interaction with these state attorneys. Wow. I knew that they knew that I was right. Mm-hmm. So off I go to the appellate court. Now, mind you, I have all the ingredients to the salad. But my good friend Larry Bankrupt, who's a constitutional attorney who's also a good friend of Joe Bannister, Larry put it all together for a beautiful salad, so to speak. So we submitted the appeal, waited for 6 months, and the judges came back and said, well, it happened a long time ago, so fraud doesn't matter. But an interesting thing, when I was doing the research, I found out that 3 states, Delaware, Alabama, and, I can't think of the other one right off the top of my head. Okay. 3 states, several years ago, do you know that they voted on the 17th Amendment to the Constitution?
No.
I have made such a stink about this for so many years. And just about the time, a little bit before I filed this lawsuit, we have 3 states that come along almost 100 years after the 17th Amendment declared ratified,
okay,
who suddenly decide to vote on a constitutional amendment. Of course, they passed it, but it doesn't matter because during my research, I found a Supreme Court decision that's never been overturned that says that states cannot vote on constitutional amendments into infinity. They, at the time of the vote, that's the way it stands. Okay. But these 3 particular things happened in 1913. You created a central bank, you figured out a way to feed it, which was the IRS, and you figured out a way to stomp on the sovereign rights of the states of the Union.
And the significance of all of this is underscoring the unconstitutionality of the federal income tax. And that has been brought up before by other guests of ours, including G. Edward Griffin, that the federal income tax it wasn't coincidental that it came out the same year as the foundation of the Federal Reserve. That's the next thing I wanted to ask you off the cover of your Why a Bankrupt America book.
Yes.
This statement, I think, will get a lot of people's attention. Do you know that not a single penny collected by the IRS funds a single function of the federal government? Can you tell us what in the world? Everybody works so hard to bring home. They do their job. They're doing their careers, whether they're self-employed, whether they're an employee. Everybody works so hard to bring home a paycheck, and the largest expense in many homes is their tax burden. But this says, and people think, well, I guess I have to pay my taxes, not only because the IRS may punish me if I don't, but because that's after all, how else will our government function? How else will our country function if we don't pay our taxes? But you're saying that's not where the money comes from to run our country. And in that case, where does our money go? So could you address both sides of that coin?
Yes. And it's a very common question, from the cover of my booklet. And this was something I learned very early on about, and you can look it up on the Internet. In 1984, Ronald Reagan had a Blue Ribbon Commission, and in that report, it was talking about government waste and everything, and on page 12, I had to reread it and read it and said, wait a minute. And it says that people, or taxpayers, I forget the exact language, would be more reluctant to pay additional income taxes if they knew that if after accounting for fraud and waste, that not a single penny of their federal income tax funds a single function of the federal government. It said that not a single penny goes towards paying for the services that the people expect.
Right.
So where does the money go? Well, it talked also in the report about what's called transfer payments. So, the Federal Reserve, we have this privately owned banking cartel, and the Congress spends more than they ever take in. So
we're certainly aware of that phenomenon because of our national deficit every year that adds to the debt. Right.
Yes, that's what people don't understand, how it got to be $21 trillion. In that, the federal income tax dollars are transferred for interest payments on this debt. The rest of it is doled out to foreign banking concerns like the International Monetary Fund, the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, the World Bank, and other financial entities. So every penny is gone. And people look at me and they go, well, how are they funding the government? All right, let's just use the easiest numbers possible. Let's say that these crooks in Congress want to spend $3 trillion. But the constitutional revenues that they receive, which are corporate taxes, taxes on cigarettes, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, tires, gasoline, things like that, military hardware sales, that whole category there. Let's say that only comes to $2 trillion. So they are $1 trillion short. So they call up the candy store, the magical money machine, and say, hey, we need another $1 trillion. That $1 trillion now becomes debt that you and I are responsible for. So what we basically have is we're renting this money. We pay usury to rent money from this banking operation so that these crooks in Congress continue to spend unconstitutionally every minute that they're in session. And that shortfall, the deficit, keeps getting piled on top of this national debt. So, they pay it down at $400 or $500 billion at a time. But when the debt's accumulating at a rate of $7 million a second, you're in trouble. And it's unpayable, it's unsustainable. Not to mention, the inflation, how the Federal Reserve creates inflation, deflation, stagnation, hyperinflation, booms, busts, recessions, and depressions. They are responsible for that because they manipulate our currency.
What about the claim that has been made by multiple people that this saying that all of the taxes go to pay the interest on the debt is only part of the story, that the Federal Reserve returns to the Treasury something like 90 or 95% of that interest each year? Is that come up in your research?
It's not that high. They do return some money to the Treasury, yes, but it's not that high. I'd have to look up what they did in 2017. They figures like that usually lag a year or two behind. So they do return some money to the Treasury. But the bottom line is, number one, why do we have to rent our own money?
Right.
In the booklet on page 5, I use the example because I think this is one of the best examples from a long time ago, Congressman Wright Patman. And he was actually a Democrat, but he served for 40 years in Congress, and for decades he was chairman of the U.S. House's Committee on Banking and Currency. And he wanted to repeal the Federal Reserve Banking Act of 1913. And he was talking about, he says when the federal government that has the exclusive power to create money creates that money and then goes into the open market and borrows it and pays interest for the use of its own money, it occurs to me that this is going too far. And he says, this is the example, it's very short. He says, now take the Panama Canal bonds. They amounted to a little less than $50 million. Actually, it was $49,800,000. By the time they were paid, the government will have paid $75 million in interest on bonds of less than $50 million. So government, which is us, is paying out $125 million to obtain the use of $49,800,000. That's the way it's worked all along. That's our policy. That's our system. So does that make any sense to you?
No, I mean, I understand, like, on an individual level, people will go in to buy a mortgage on a house, and they'll take out a 30-year mortgage because they want the house now, and they can't afford to buy it now. They'd have to save up for 10 or 12 or 15 years to be able to buy it. So they want the house now, and then they know that they're going to end up paying 2.5 or 3 times the purchase price by the time they're done paying off the loan. But that's because they feel that they have no other option if they need the house now. Some people don't do that, and they wisely save up and buy their first house with cash. That's just atypical. But for an entire nation to voluntarily act as though it can't create its own money and it needs to go to a banking conglomerate and borrow its money into existence, it makes absolutely no sense to me. I've never understood that.
Well, the sad reality is that none of this is taught in the school systems. I mean, I'm up there in years, but I do not recall any of this in school. I didn't. Seriously, 29 years ago, this happened purely by accident for me. I've written 5 books plus my little booklet and another little booklet called Blind Loyalty, which was on vote fraud. But I had written my first book, and I was at a book show. The publishing industry holds their annual convention every other year on West Coast or East Coast, West Coast. And my late husband and I lived in Colorado at the time because he was a colonel in the Army at Fort Carson. So I go to Los Angeles for this book club, and my publisher, we're sitting there, and of course everybody wanted to see Storm and Norman and General Powell and all the rest of them. So I was sitting there, and he hands me this book, and it's like 600 pages. He said, "Here, you'll like this. It's right up your alley." And the book opened to about the middle of the book, and it was the chapter on the Federal Reserve. And I sat there, and I started reading this. I said, wait a minute, this can't be right. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So when I got back to Colorado, I opened the book, and I said, oh, my gosh, that scared me. I gave up my career, my paycheck, and I did all, the Federal Reserve Bank in Denver was only about 15, 20 minutes with the traffic. So I went down there and tried to get as much information as I could, and then I started reading everything I could, and that's how I came to know Dr. Edwin Vieira, who's a genius on this. That's how it started.
And what was this 600-page book that arrested your attention?
Called to Serve by Bogreitz.
Called to Serve. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It was. And I was reading about the New World Order and everything in that book. We're talking. This is back in 1989, 1990, and I had just finished leaving my job. I became a federal whistleblower because I worked at Peterson Air Force Base Command, NORAD.
Okay.
Loved my job though. My job was inside Cheyenne Mountain and the other Air Force base out there. When the Star Wars initiative was, I had to have a retinal scan to get on the base out there.
Oh boy. And
you can't get in, at that time, you couldn't get into Cheyenne Mountain without a top secret clearance. But, oh my gosh, it was just like watching Star Wars or something. I mean, it was so cool. But I filed a fraud, waste, and abuse against my own job. I went in as a GS-11, and there was no job. My stupid advisor, Sandra Brown, she was a GS-12, and she wanted to move up to GM-13, and she had to supervise one person. So she creates a fake job. I get hired, and I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs. So finally, I went over to the tag office at Fort Carson, the Army, and talked to the lawyers over there, and they said, well, you're going to get fired. And I said, I have to do what's right, so I go back to Pete Field and informed the general. And I said, I need to file a fraud, waste, and abuse with the Inspector General, which I did. And, of course, they wanted to punish me. And I said, good. I'm going to the local TV station, and I'm going to tell them all about it. I'm going to tell them that the engineers who sit next to me sit and read Playboy magazine all morning long, or they're on the phone doing personal business like looking for parts for their cars, their classic cars, or this, that, and the other, and not one of the three has passed the test that's required for them to keep that grade. And so the Inspector General, though, his final report said Mrs. Kidd is correct. The job she was hired to do is better suited for a part-time college student of maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. In the interim, they transferred me to contracting, and that's when I got involved in my contracts with Inside Cheyenne Mountain and the Star Wars initiative out there. But at the end of the 12 months, I was gone. So here I am. I'm written my book and everything, but it's like the Lord just put his hand on my shoulder in Los Angeles. What are the odds of something like that happening? But my curiosity I just had to find out the answers. And so then when I did enough research, I said, something has to be done. So I wrote this little booklet, Why Bankrupt America, and I got my friends together, and in February of 1993, we started picketing the Federal Reserve in downtown Denver in the snow, and people were jumping off the trolley car because you can't drive on 16th Street Mall where the Fed building is. And on September 29th of 1993, we were in Washington, D.C., and took 1,753,000 signatures to Congress to abolish the Federal Reserve and the income tax. And eventually I kept my little booklet to 2004, and I sold 1,653,000 copies of it at cost. I didn't pay myself a single penny because it scared me, and because I knew by the time I had written the booklet that this whole system was going to implode someday. And people like myself and Dr. Edwin Vieira and so many others in 2005, our columns were, really honing in on the fact that the banks were going to blow up and the housing market was going to blow up. And by November of 2007, of course, it was accelerating. And then by July of 2008, the whole thing melted down. But it's underway again, and it cannot be stopped this time, and there will be no recovery. Not that there's been a recovery, but it's going to be worse.
Two things that come to mind. Yeah. That's what a lot of people are concerned about, is that the scope and scale of this is going to be, it will no longer be, the United States government being able to step in and say, well, we're the lender of last resort, and we can bail out all these banks and everything like that. Now it's the sovereign level at every country, all on last legs of debt dependency. But two things that people will say when you say you don't have to pay your income tax according to the Constitution is, number one, well, if I don't pay my income tax, I'll go to prison. And number two, if I don't pay my income tax, the country won't be able to function because it depends on our tax payments to run. You've addressed both of those, but I'm not sure it gets people to where they feel like they can take action because... No,
don't. I warn people, don't do it. Don't stop paying the income tax. As much as we know that we are right, just like Joe Bannister and just like Tommy Cryer and just like Fergie, that's her first name, the FedEx pilot.
Yeah.
Tommy Cryer, and your listeners can look this up just by using a search engine, Tommy Cryer, Cryer, the memorandum. Tommy wrote a 90-page document, the memorandum. And if anybody reads that, they will fully understand that, as Joe Bannister said, as Larry B. Kraft, a brilliant constitutional attorney, that domestic Americans are not subject to the income tax. But we have this big cabal of criminals who are desperately at this point trying to hold the whole thing together until they can figure out some way to replace it down the line. So no, don't, as much as it might gall you, don't do it. There was a couple contacted me from New Mexico, probably 7-8 years ago, something like that. And she and her husband had considerable holdings. And she said, they've come after us, Stevie. And she said, we have fought them for a year. And I said, here's what I would do if I was in your shoes, but I cannot advise you what to do. Just get with your lawyer and do a compromise with them. They want X amount of dollars. You say, your attorney says, this is it. I said, because what it's doing is tearing you guys apart. It's going to put you in an early grave. Because a year or so after Tommy's acquittal, I was in California and got an email, and he had a heart attack and died in his sleep. And my heart just broke. The IRS hounded him and beat him into the ground. So what the couple did was and they ended up paying nothing compared to what the IRS wanted. What the IRS wanted was to get them back into the scheme of things, back into the fold.
Back in line, yeah.
Yes, so to keep them under the thumb. But we are so far down the road at this point. Back in 2007, former Congressman Ron Paul introduced a bill to abolish the Federal Reserve Banking Act.
You bet.
In 2007, it had 0 co-sponsors for the 2 years because every session of Congress, by design from the framers of the Constitution, during that 2-year period that the bill was in committee, there was not a single co-sponsor. Why? Because without the magical money machine loaning all of this debt, because that's what we have to remember, that this is debt. They create debt and to spend debt. So without it, and that's the subject of my column today on newswithviews.com.
Okay.
How can we bring our troops home? The only way is to abolish the central bank and cut off the money. Because without the Fed, there would be no borrowing over $3 trillion so far into Iraq and Afghanistan, 16 years in Afghanistan. Next month makes 17 years since 9/11. For what? So our troops can continue guarding the poppy field over there so they can ship their heroin and cocaine into the United States? How hypocritical can you get? But without the ability to borrow all of this money, they would not be able to fund the unconstitutional cabinets like Health and Human Services. There's nothing in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution that's $1.1 trillion. The Federal Department of Education, which I was at the inside the GOP convention in San Diego in 1996, and one of the promises was that they were going to get, and Ronald Reagan promised it was one of his campaign promises for the 1980 election, to get rid of the unconstitutional Federal Department of Education because we don't need it. But it sucks down $66 billion a year. But that $66 billion doesn't exist. It has to be borrowed. So you and I and your grandchildren, we all continue to pay usury to the bankers for it. So in my column today, this is the only way to bring home the troops. But we're so far down the road, and this is going to implode in our lifetimes. This is not something that's, some nebulous theory out there that, people just treat it like it's something, that have to. The world is so far in debt, and there is no money. And the solution that my friend Dr. Edwin Vieira proposed, and it's in the booklet, he gave me permission to reprint one of his columns, is for the states to take up sound constitutional money bills. And he has testified, and we don't get paid for all this stuff. But, he has testified to state legislatures, to their banking committees, and these bills keep getting killed. And a prime example is here in Texas. Texas, Nevada, Montana, and North Dakota, we are the 4 states in the union. Our legislatures only meet every other odd year, not to exceed 140 days. So our legislature's been out of session since May of 2017.
Okay.
They come back into session in January. So my good friends, and they're a lot smarter than I am, put together probably the strongest constitutional sound money bill that deals with the states. State legislatures setting up a depository where they do electronic gold and silver as the form of money. which is totally constitutional. I know we don't have time to go into it right now, but going back to the Civil War and then through World War I, and there's a whole bunch of court cases in the Supreme Court, withheld and reinforced the sovereignty of the states to do this. And so when you have, by doing it at the state level, and you use gold and silver, it would be just the same as any other bank. The state would set up a depository. The gold, your gold, your money goes into that depository, and you use a debit card just like you use your bank. And interestingly, I guess it's been about 3 years ago now, our governor, Greg Abbott.
When you say our governor, you're in Texas? You're a Texas resident?
Yes, I'm in Texas. Okay. Yeah, I live in West Texas.
Okay.
Governor Abbott sent a formal request to the New York Federal Reserve asking for Texas's $1 billion in gold. And I thought to myself when I was reading the press release from the governor's office, I thought, this ought to be interesting. We know darn well that the Federal Reserve in New York doesn't have $1 billion sitting in the basement. I think a lot of it was cleaned out at 9/11. But then, of course, came the depository. Well, this gold depository vault is now finished. Just last month, they just finished it.
Okay.
And I'm waiting to hear back from the guy at the state capitol, at the governor's office, what is the next step. I am just waiting on pins and needles to see what the Federal Reserve does about returning Texas's $1 billion in gold, which is exactly, coincidentally, the same amount that the Texas college system trust. They actually bought, this was about, after 2008, so maybe 2009 or 2010, the Texas Trust for all the colleges and all of that, they bought $1 billion in gold. They liquidated cash, this phony paper money, for $1 billion in gold. But this is going to be very interesting. But going back to the constitutional sound money bill, my friends, they drove, I'm 6 hours from the Capitol, and Tom and some of they all live, 2, maybe 3 hours from the Capitol. So it was, a lot of hard work went into putting together this constitutional sound money bill where the states would start using the gold and silver system and it'd be electronic, and how to gradually integrate it and how businesses would use it and stuff. So we were sure that it was going to pass. Absolutely certain. I mean, talking, and not me, I was not able to do it. My husband's health was very, very bad. And then, of course, he passed away. But we were certain this would pass and that Governor Abbott would sign it into law. And you guess what happened? Right before the end of the session in May of 2017, the House Banking Committee chairman, who's a Republican, killed the bill.
This is the Texas House?
Yep. Our state legislature is Republican-controlled, House and Senate, and the governor's mansion for the last has been Republican for, Greg Abbott's been governor for, 6 years now, and before him, Tricky Ricky Perry was our governor for 12 years. So after Ann Richards, who was a liberal Democrat, it's been Republican all the way. But this is not going to be good, because when the dollar collapses, what are the states going to do to be able to pay their bills, their pensions for the state, the schools, and nurses, or whatever it is? How are they going to conduct business when you have this worthless currency? And this is one of the things, that I pointed out on page 9 of my booklet. Looking at the inflation calendar in May of 2017, if in 1913 I purchased an item for $20, then in 2017 that same item costs $492.53. So the cumulative rate of inflation was 2,362%.
Yeah, people have talked about the degradation of the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar since the formation of the Federal Reserve.
Yes, but this is what the American people don't understand. And like I said, I retired my booklet in 2004 because of everybody was getting computers, but the Internet's a wonderful thing, but there's 3 billion pages on it at this point. And unless you know what you're looking for, and how credible is the information. Somebody sent me an email yesterday. I was trying to write my column and said, "Oh, Devvy, you got to watch this short video. It's a cartoon about the Federal Reserve and money." So I sat through about 10 minutes of it. It was, to me, dumb and stupid, but it was fairly accurate. But so I scanned ahead towards the very end, and there was the big lie. That John Kennedy was going to abolish the Federal Reserve, and he issued an executive order, 11113. And the truth is that executive order that President Kennedy issued was simply a bookkeeping executive order. It had nothing to do with returning to the gold standard or anything else. And so that video that's been viewed by over 802,000 people now believe the lie that's about 4 minutes from the end of the video. I thought to myself, oh my gosh. But in any event, last year I just kept getting mail, "Devvy, you got to get your booklet out there, people." And so I said, yeah, because everybody's pressed for time. And, I write a weekly column, but people can miss a column. They may not know where to look for it, or they end up on, some page that does not have accurate information. So I decided to put the booklet out again, and you have a copy of it.
How can people get a hold of a copy? I know how I got a hold of it was because you sent it to me, but how can most people get a hold of this?
Just go to my website, devvy.com.
That's DEVVY.com.
Yeah. Delta Echo Victor Yankee.com.
And there they'll find a link to be able to order a copy of Why
right
a
there.
Bankrupt America?
Mm-hmm. It's right there on the front page. But employers, not big companies like Microsoft, but employers who employ 10 or 15 people, they've been ordering them and giving them out to their employees because the booklet is not political. It affects everybody, regardless of if you're short or tall, Republican, Independent, Green, whatever. This affects every American.
It's chock full of quotes from Thomas Jefferson and others. It really talks about the real origins of all this stuff. And there's lots of endnotes in the end for people who want to do their research to see how you back this up.
Well, originally, in the first edition of Why Bankrupt America, which impressed Joe Bannister so much, was I had listed about 10 individuals, like Larry B. Kraft for one, and Dr. Edwin Bear, that you could call them on a telephone. I mean, this was 1993. We didn't have the Internet. We didn't have email. We had fax machines. I used to put out a newsletter. We had the telephone. But Joe started calling all of these experts, and he said that's one of the things that made it so credible. So in the back, towards the back of the book, I give these source references that you can look up on the Internet and read former members of Congress. Now, who were on the bank, Louis McFadden. He actually wanted to charge the Federal Reserve Board of Governors with treason. Well, he actually did charge him with treason in 1934. And when you read his charges, and he explains why, that this is, the biggest money heist in the history of the world, but certainly in this country, you really begin to understand the problem. And it's not. It can get complicated, but it's fiat currency and fractional banking is a fraud. They create money out of nothing, and then they turn around and charge us usury on it.
Now, Joe Bannister talked about educating ourselves so that we can become more informed jurors, if nothing else, just as those important jurors. You mentioned earlier, and I wanted to touch on this, but we left the subject so quickly, that the IRS wants to keep people in line, keep them under their thumb. And as you pointed out, one of those acquaintances of yours was able to settle for pennies on the dollar. So it isn't about the money in those cases. It's about the precedent and not letting the lie leak out, not letting light shine on the lie, because tell me if I'm getting this right, that if the general public became aware from jury after jury acquitting people because they saw through these sham charges and they understood, then the whole jig would be up. The whole game would blow up in their face, because you need the compliance of the masses, and it's hard to maintain the compliance of the masses if everybody starts to know this is all a fraud.
Just like the Prohibition area, where people by the millions just said, screw, well, up yours, I'm going to have a beer or a shot of Irish whiskey or whatever.
Right.
And, then the Congress had to backtrack on it. But yes, Joe is absolutely right. Knowledge is power, and when you have that power, then you can put it to good use. And here's another tip for your listeners. A lot of people, I'm so grateful for every job that an American's been able to find since President Trump was elected. I'm so happy for people, to be able to find a job. But a lot of people, Americans are back to spending like there's no tomorrow. I think a lot of them don't realize that the tax cuts expire in 2025. The corporate taxes in Trump's tax bill are permanent. But these rats in Congress, the personal federal income tax cuts expires in 2025, and one has to wonder what they know that the American people don't know. But the IRS has something called a 911 form for folks that are really in, terrible financial situation and they can't pay their taxes. And I did this for my little sister. I filed a 911 form for her, and they forgave all the back taxes because it was uncollectible. And so then she was able to start from scratch, So
I was going to mention that my parents were war tax resistors, and Joe reminded us that you don't get to pick and choose legally. You don't have a legal basis for saying I don't want to pay these taxes because I don't agree with what the government's spending them on. But one of the principles that their support group that they belonged to came through, which was they were Quakers, was that you can legally it's illegal to quote unquote evade taxes according to the system, but it's legal to avoid taxes, and one way to do that is by making sure that you don't reach the taxable level. If you actually live below what the federal declared poverty line or whatever through frugality and that kind of thing, there's ways that people might have available to them if they want to consider that kind of a lifestyle choice.
But what kind of a lifestyle choice is that when we promote independence and self-reliance and the American dream? This reminds me of Social Security. There's a bill in Congress. This is the third time Representative Massey, he's the Republican out of Kentucky,
Tom Massey,
the third time. This makes 6 years this bill has been in Congress to stop federal taxation on Social Security benefits.
Right.
Because Social Security is a tax that goes to the general fund of the Treasury and is not earmarked for any specific spending purpose. So correctly said the U.S. Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So you pay this tax, but then when you retire, they tax you again, which reduces your benefits. So it's double taxation. This round, which the bill expires, H.R. 2552, expires December 31st. There are all of 15 co-sponsors. One is a Democrat. Now, these people in Congress, it's an election year. We love seniors. We love you seniors. Yeah. You do? Then why haven't you passed that bill? There's no doubt in my mind that Trump would sign it. But the other thing about Social Security is, say you retire. I mean, the more active you are, activity to me is the key to longevity. Mm-hmm. But Social Security, if you make more than $16,000 a year, we're going to take one for every $2 that you receive in Social Security. We're going to take it back. You say, well, wait a minute. Not only does that kill initiative, but I already paid that.
Right.
You can thank your incumbent that you might have voted for in the primary for not doing what the right thing. There's so much that the American people just don't know. But I'm hopeful that this edition, of the booklet will be as successful. And when people say, "How did you sell 1,653,000 copies of that booklet? You must have spent a ton on advertising." I didn't spend a penny. I didn't have a penny to spend on advertising. It was just being on talk radio. And people ordering the book and giving it to their friends in at church and especially at gun shows. Oh, man, people get it anywhere that they could. And that's how so many copies were sold. And like I said, I sold them at cost. But I'm hopeful that we will be able to educate millions more, with bringing it out, because it's something tangible that people can hold in their hand. I know we're running out of time, but about a month after the first edition of my booklet came out, John and I were living in Lake, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. And I went down to the end. I was going to the post office. I got down to the end of the street to make a left turn, and there's a bus stop there. And I slowly entered, made a left turn. And I looked at the man at the bus stop, and he was dressed in a nice suit, and his briefcase was on the concrete. And I hit the brake, and I looked again, and he had my booklet open. He was standing there reading it. And I went, oh, my God. As soon as I got home from the post office, I called all my friends to tell them. It was so exciting.
I'm a celebrity.
I didn't know that. I didn't even know who this person was. And there
that
he
must
was
have been
in my
heartwarming
own.
for you, though, to see that story was getting out. Now, you mentioned that with all this awareness, you mentioned in the introduction that you became a prepper back in 1994. Before we let you go, can you give our viewers just a couple ideas of what that means to you?
Well, John was transferred from Oakland Army Base to Fort Carson in Colorado. And the first blizzard that came along, and we couldn't get out of the driveway. And I thought to myself, well, this isn't good. What if I hadn't gone to the store before yesterday?
Right.
So we had a big, huge basement because John was a colonel. We were able to live off base. So I started not spending, $10,000 all at once, but I went out and I bought what I thought, if we had a storm that lasted a week, say, spaghetti sauce and a nice little stove with propane and food that really didn't need cooking,
Sure.
They had granola type bars back then and stuff.
Sure.
But what we could use and, to eat healthy, because I've been an organic eater for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I would label everything with the date. And so when it came time to go to the store, I would go downstairs to the store. And since John died, I have food storage, organic food storage. So, but before my husband died, the spare bedroom was just like a grocery store. But everything had a date label on it.
Yeah.
So before I went to the store, I'd run down into the basement. But I've kept it up all these years because you never know whether it's man-made or, when Katrina hit, oh my God, and of course the flood in Houston last year,
right.
It was just awful. I gave what I could to the doggy rescues and the Good Samaritan's Purse and groups like that. So, but you just don't know. And these people that live in these big, massive decay, crime-infested cities, when the lights go out, they're going to come, looking for you. And one of the reasons we left California was John's health, and he was a native Texan. But I wanted to be in a state where the Second Amendment's king, and we did not want to be in a big city. And I live in a smaller town between Lubbock and Midland, Texas. Mm-hmm. But here, the Second Amendment's king, so they better not come around.
That means a lot to a lot of our listeners as well. And Devvy, you've been generous with your time. We've been speaking with Devvy Kidd. That's DEVVY KIDD. She has her own website at devvy.com. That's DEVVY.com. She was a federal employee working in Cheyenne Mountain. If you don't know what that is, you've got to look it up. When she got an eye-opening that led her to basically declare her own job a waste and fraud, and kind of roiled the beast from there and hasn't stopped since. So, Devvy, thank you so much for joining us this first time on Reluctant Preppers.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.